There is a quiet, brutal truth about human nature that polite society will never admit to you. The more words you use to explain your value, the less anyone believes you possess it. Think about the last time you found yourself in the middle of a misunderstanding. You sat there, drafting a long, perfectly polite text message. You deleted it. You rewrote it. You meticulously calibrated every sentence to sound reasonable, mature, and deeply understanding. You wanted to make sure they knew you were not angry, just hurt, just trying to communicate. You hit send, you waited, and the response you received hours later was a single dismissive sentence. Or perhaps you were sitting in a meeting, pitching an idea or defending your work. You felt the room grow cold and panic set in. So you started over-explaining. You justified every detail. You laughed nervously at your own expense, practically begging them to nod, to smile, to validate your existence in that space. And they looked at you, not with respect, but with mild clinical irritation. You thought you were communicating. They knew you were auditioning. Look closely at how people move through the world. The vast majority of individuals walk through life as if they are perpetually waiting to be selected. They soften their opinions the moment they sense disagreement. They dilute their boundaries to avoid causing offense. They apologize for simply taking up space in a room. This is the psychology of the subordinate. You have been quietly conditioned to believe that if you are just accommodating enough, reasonable enough, and generous enough with your understanding, eventually the world will reward you with respect and loyalty. But reality operates on a much colder physics. The world does not reward accommodation, it rewards weight. When you over-explain yourself, you are broadcasting a very specific, desperate frequency. You are signaling to the other person that you do not actually trust your own reality unless they sign off on it. You are handing them the judge's gavel and explicitly asking them to determine your worth. But human beings are inherently opportunistic. When you hand someone absolute authority over your emotional state, they do not feel a sense of gracious gratitude. They feel a subtle, creeping contempt. They sense that you are empty. They sense that you are starved for their approval. And here is the absolute law of human dynamics you must burn into your mind. Power does not negotiate with hunger. Let us examine the exact mechanics of this trap. Imagine a standard negotiation. This could be a negotiation for a salary, a title, or simply a negotiation for basic human decency in a relationship. The moment you state your boundary, the other person goes quiet. They apply a tiny amount of social pressure. In that silence, the weak man panics. He cannot bear the tension, so he rushes to fill the void. He begins offering aggressive discounts on his own dignity. He says things like, "I mean, if that doesn't work for you, we can try something else," or, "I don't mean to sound demanding, I just want what's fair." Every caveat you offer is a drop of blood in the water. You believe you are being polite and collaborative. They realize you are terrified of their disapproval. They now know that your boundaries are not walls, they are merely suggestions. You must understand that the people who walk over you, who use you, and who dismiss you do not do it because they are evil masterminds. They do it because your behavior actively invites it. You are wearing a neon sign that says your standards are entirely negotiable. You are attempting to buy their loyalty with your submission, but submission is a terrible currency. It only ever buys exploitation. The individuals you secretly admire, the ones who seem to move through life with a strange, untouchable gravity, do not operate this way. They do not audition for the roles in their own lives. They assume the throne, and they quietly let the world decide if it wishes to bow. If it does not, they simply walk into a different room. Mainstream culture constantly feeds you a false premise. It tells you to just speak your truth. It demands that you be infinitely vulnerable, that you lay all your cards on the table, that you communicate endlessly to resolve every minor friction. This is a trap designed by the weak, for the weak. Complete emotional exposure without tactical restraint is not bravery, it is carelessness. When you give strangers and opportunists unrestricted access to your internal monologue, you hand them the exact blueprint of how to dismantle you. They learn exactly what you fear. They discover exactly what you crave. They map out precisely how much they can withdraw their attention before you start chasing them in the dark. Real presence is not about being loud. The weakest man in the room is frequently the one shouting the loudest, desperate to prove he exists, performing for a crowd he secretly fears. Real presence is the absence of performance. It is the chilling realization that you no longer need the audience to clap. Think about the last time someone truly commanded your absolute respect. They did not achieve it by hovering around you, eagerly seeking eye contact. They achieved it by being entirely comfortable in their own architecture, completely detached from your judgment. They were a closed circuit. You were drawn to them precisely because they did not need you to complete them. Before we dismantle the mechanics of silence, pause for a moment and look at this strictly through a psychological lens. Your desperate urge to over-explain is not a fundamental character flaw. It is a deeply ingrained survival mechanism. From childhood, you were systematically conditioned by authority figures to believe that compliance equals safety, and that conflict equals abandonment. You are not fighting just a bad habit. You are fighting your own nervous system. The fact that you are still listening to my voice right now tells me that you are finally ready to brutally dissect that conditioning. I do not ask for blind loyalty on this channel, and I do not deal in false motivation. I only ask for your absolute, unvarnished honesty with yourself. If you have given me your time and your subscription to reach this point, your attention is deeply respected here. Now, let us examine how you weaponize the void. You have spent years studying how to be acceptable to others. You have memorized their moods, their preferences, their micro-expressions. You have spent your life folding yourself into smaller and smaller shapes just to fit into the spaces they left behind. It is exhausting. It is a slow, quiet death of the self. It is time to stop viewing yourself through the eyes of people who do not even possess the discipline to understand themselves. Their judgment was never a measurement of your true capacity. It was simply a reflection of their own utility. If you are useful to them, they praise you. If you set a firm boundary, they call you difficult. You cannot build a foundation on shifting sand, and you cannot build a sovereign identity on the opinions of opportunists. The first act of reclaiming your power is recognizing the humiliating audition you have been performing. It is seeing the desperate texts, the nervous laughter, and the endless justifications for exactly what they are, a plea for permission to exist. You must rip that plea to shreds. You must become a person who states their truth once, clearly, and then lets the silence do the heavy lifting. But recognizing that you are locked inside this audition is only the first step. The next is understanding the exact mechanism that keeps you trapped. You must stop pleading for permission to exist and understand that the very mechanism keeping you trapped in that audition is your own voice. The compulsion to fill the empty space is the invisible leash they use to walk you. Consider the architecture of any room you walk into. Look immediately for the man who is commanding the most attention. He is speaking endlessly. He is laughing loudly at his own jokes. He is aggressively inserting himself into every available conversation. He operates under the tragic assumption that volume is equivalent to dominance. He forces his presence upon the space because he is absolutely terrified of being overlooked. Now, look closely at the eyes of the people surrounding him. They are smiling, but they are merely humoring him. They see right through his noise to the hollow core beneath. Now, shift your focus to the quiet operator in the corner. He sits back. He observes the shifting alliances. He speaks only when the words carry heavy, undeniable weight. When he finally leans forward and opens his mouth, the entire room falls still. They stop drinking. They stop whispering. They lean in. They do this because scarcity creates intrinsic value. The loud man leaks his power everywhere, but the quiet man is a sealed vault. Over-communication is almost always a symptom of profound, unmanaged anxiety. It is the desperate belief that if you can just arrange your words perfectly, if you can just provide enough context, you can control how another person perceives your reality. You cannot. The more you talk, the more you hand them the raw materials to construct a cage around you. They listen to your breathless explanations. They detect the slight tremor of need in your tone, and they mentally categorize you as someone who can be easily managed. They realize that you are deeply uncomfortable with tension. And the person who cannot tolerate tension is the person who will always lose the negotiation. Let us bring this into a sharper, more intimate focus. Imagine you are at a dinner or sitting across from a colleague in a high-stakes meeting. Without warning, they slide a passive-aggressive remark across the table. It is masked as a joke, but the intention is sharp. It is designed to unsettle you. It is a calculated test of your frame. The average person takes the bait instantly. Their ego flares, and they immediately begin to defend themselves. They try to laugh it off, or they offer a clumsy counter-argument, catching the social grenade and holding it tightly to their chest. They perform exactly as predicted. But what happens when you choose to do absolutely nothing? You look at them, you hold their gaze, you let the silence stretch out and expand. 1 second, 2 seconds, 3 seconds. You do not smile, you do not frown, you do not nod. You simply offer them the void. Silence is an apex predator in human dynamics. When you refuse to react, the conversational momentum swings violently backward. The passive-aggressive remark is left hanging dead in the air, naked and exposed for everyone to see. The attacker suddenly realizes that they are the ones standing on thin ice. The void makes them deeply uncomfortable, and in their panic, they will inevitably try to rescue the moment. They will nervously explain their own joke. They will stutter. They will backpedal. They will completely crumble under the crushing weight of your absolute refusal to participate in their childish game. You did not have to raise your voice. You did not have to argue. You simply allowed their own toxicity to suffocate them. Deploying this kind of silence requires an iron suppression of your own ego. The physiological urge to defend yourself is overwhelming. Your heart rate spikes. Your mind races with clever comebacks. Your pride screams at you to correct the record and prove your worth. You must learn to override this primitive programming. The ego wants to shout, but strategy demands stillness. When you master the pause, you become a psychological mirror. You reflect the other person's insecurities back at them with terrifying clarity. People are terrified of silence because it forces them to face their own reflection without the distraction of your reaction. By removing yourself as a target, you force them to deal with their own aggressive intent. The master strategist, Machiavelli, understood that mystery is the ultimate armor. Human beings have an obsessive need to map out the people around them. They want to chart your traumas, identify your triggers, uncover your flaws, and understand your desires. Once they have mapped you, they can control you. They know exactly which button to press to make you angry and which string to pull to make you compliant. Strategic silence destroys their map. It creates a thick, impenetrable fog of war. When you stop giving strangers unrestricted access to your inner monologue, you become unpredictable. They cannot formulate a strategy against you because they do not know where your boundaries end and your ambitions begin. You become a shadow they cannot pin down. This principle applies just as lethally in modern digital communication. When someone sends you an emotionally charged text message, an accusation, or a subtle provocation, they expect an immediate return on their investment. They want the rapid dopamine hit of your defense. Deny them. Put the phone down. Let the message sit for 3 hours or 3 days. Let them watch the hours tick by, trapped in their own escalating anxiety, wondering what you are thinking. You dictate the tempo of the interaction. You control the clock. Remember the rule that governs this entire game. Power does not negotiate with hunger. When you rush to fill the silence, you are starving for their comfort. When you withhold your reaction, you prove that you are already full. You must practice this until it becomes your default nature. Speak more slowly. Lower the register of your voice. When you are asked a probing question, deliberately pause for 2 full seconds before answering. Let them wait for your intellect. Let your stillness create a deep, unsettling curiosity. Let your restraint make them quietly wonder what you know that they do not. The world studies your behavior to learn how it is permitted to treat you, and a man who is entirely comfortable in the silence signals that he cannot be easily moved. Yet, deploying silence without underlying substance is just a different, quieter way of hiding, which brings us to the currency that actually buys your freedom. The silence we just discussed is only lethal if the person on the other side believes you possess the capacity to never speak to them again. You must look brutally at the environments you currently tolerate. Think about the dead-end social circle that constantly makes you the subtle punchline of their jokes. Think about the toxic relationship where your endless loyalty is rewarded with cold indifference, or the stagnant workplace where your extra hours and bleeding stress are met with nothing but empty promises. You complain about these situations endlessly. You vent to your friends. You ruminate in the dark. You internally scream about the deep, agonizing unfairness of it all. You demand respect with your words, but you betray your words with your actions. Because every single day, you continue to show up. This is the moment of cold clarity you have been desperately avoiding. The world is not disrespecting you because you are uniquely unlucky, or because the universe has singled you out for punishment. The world disrespects you because you constantly, continuously signal that you will tolerate it. You provide a masterclass in how to mistreat you, and then you act shocked when people follow your instructions. You are the architect of your own humiliation. When you stay in a room where your value is deliberately ignored, you prove that your fear of the void is stronger than your self-respect. People do not listen to your boundaries, they watch your feet. If you say, "Do not speak to me that way," but remain seated at the table, your words are meaningless noise. A warning without a consequence is not a boundary. It is merely a negotiation tactic. And predators love a negotiation, because it means you are still willing to play their game. You are negotiating for basic dignity from a position of absolute starvation. You want them to change, but you need them to stay. But you must remember the absolute law of human dynamics. Power does not negotiate with hunger. If they know you will not leave, they have absolutely no incentive to change their behavior. Your presence is guaranteed, so your presence loses all of its value. The only currency that actually buys your freedom is leverage. And the ultimate form of leverage in human dynamics is the willingness and the capability to walk away. Do not confuse this with a theatrical tantrum. The weak man packs his bags, slams the door, and storms out into the night, secretly hoping his partner will chase him down the driveway. He blocks phone numbers, only to unblock them 3 hours later to see if they noticed. That is not walking away. That is a performance. A tantrum is just another, louder form of begging. True leverage is a cold, calculated, and permanent departure. It is the sudden extraction of your energy, your time, and your attention, executed without anger and without apology. The moment you truly walk away without a long final speech, without a dramatic plea for closure, without explaining yourself for the 100th time, you violently disrupt the power dynamic. The manipulator expects a negotiation. They expect you to fight for your place in their hierarchy. They expect you to write them a letter explaining how much they hurt you. When you simply vanish, you leave them holding an empty leash. You completely rob them of their supply. Nothing terrifies an opportunist more than a target who suddenly unplugs from their reality. They press the old buttons and nothing happens. They deploy the old guilt trips and they echo into a void. You do not hate them. You do not seek revenge against them. You simply reclassify them as a ghost in your history, and you move on. But to execute this, you must overcome the darkest fear that haunts the modern mind, the fear of loneliness. The fear of the empty room keeps millions of intelligent men and women anchored to miserable, degrading lives. They prefer the familiar pain of disrespect over the unfamiliar cold of isolation. They suffer from the sunk cost fallacy, believing that because they have invested years into a toxic friendship or a broken system, they must see it through. Machiavelli would view this as supreme foolishness. The time you have lost is already gone. Staying only burns your future time to protect your past mistakes. You must train your nervous system to accept that temporary loneliness is fundamentally cleaner than permanent self-betrayal. When you are perfectly willing to sit in an empty room, you can never be held hostage by a full one. You must develop the discipline to place people exactly where their conduct has earned them. Some people belong in your inner circle, some belong at a polite distance, and some belong nowhere in your future. This is not cruelty, it is order. A kingdom without walls is not a utopia, it is a target. Your time, your energy, and your attention are finite resources. Every hour you spend trying to convince a manipulator to treat you with basic decency is an hour stolen from your own empire. Let them have their misunderstanding of you. Let them call you cold. Let them tell stories about how you changed, how you became arrogant, or how you abandoned them. Their discomfort is not evidence of your corruption. It is evidence that their access to your life has been permanently revoked. You must stop viewing relationships, jobs, and social status as things you cannot survive without. When you strip away the illusion that you need these specific people to validate your existence, you experience a violent, clearing relief. You realize that the cage door was never locked. You were simply holding it shut from the inside because you were afraid of the woods. It is time to walk into the woods. Let the people who take you for granted experience the full, devastating weight of your absence. Let them learn that your presence is a privilege that must be actively maintained, not a baseline reality they can abuse at their convenience. Once you strip away this illusion of dependency, you must replace it with an architecture they cannot dismantle. You must learn to control the invisible battleground of human interaction, a concept known as the frame. Every conversation, every conflict, and every silent exchange contains an unspoken contest. The contest is simple. Who defines the reality of what is happening right now? The person who controls the meaning of the interaction controls the emotional direction of everyone involved in it. If you do not actively set the frame, you will inevitably be pulled into someone else's. And the frames designed by manipulators, narcissists, and opportunists are always constructed to make you weak. Let us observe this in its most common, insidious environment, the modern workplace. Imagine you open your inbox and see a public email thread copied to your superiors. A colleague, attempting to cover up their own incompetence, sends a message dripping with weaponized politeness. They write something like, "Just circling back on this project, as we seem to have missed the deadline due to your delay in sending the files. The trap has been set. The bait is dangling in the water." Your heart rate immediately accelerates. Your ego feels the burn of public injustice. Your primitive instinct screams at you to clear your name. So, you hit reply all. You draft a defensive paragraph, citing dates and times, aggressively explaining that you were actually waiting on their input, and that the delay was not your fault. You have just lost the game. It does not matter if you are factually correct. By passionately defending yourself against their accusation, you have unconsciously accepted their frame. They positioned themselves as the judge, and you immediately accepted the role of the accused on trial. You have legitimized their authority to question you. Even if you win the argument, you look frantic, defensive, and easily provoked. You played exactly the role they assigned to you in their emotional theater. A sovereign operator steps completely outside the frame. They look at the bait, recognize the poison, and refuse to bite. How does the strategist handle the email? They wait. They let the anxiety of the sender peak. Then, they reply with terrifying, emotionless precision, stripping away the accusation entirely. They write, "The project timeline was adjusted to accommodate the data received on Tuesday. The next phase will commence tomorrow at 9. There is no defense, there is no apology, there is no counterattack. You simply step over their manufactured drama and dictate the forward momentum. You establish a new reality." The colleague is left looking petty and disorganized, while you appear as an immovable force, focused entirely on the objective. You did not fight them inside their house, you simply bulldozed the entire property. This exact same power dynamic governs the deeply personal spaces of your life. Consider the romantic partner or the close friend who uses their attention as a weapon. You sense a sudden shift in their behavior. They become distant. They take hours to reply to a simple message. They offer one-word answers. This is not an accident. It is a calculated test. They are manufacturing distance to see if you will panic and close the gap. They want to set a frame where they are the ultimate prize, and you are the desperate pursuer. The weak man falls into the trap immediately. He begins to audit his own behavior, wondering what he did wrong. He sends the double text. He asks, "Are you okay? Is something on your mind?" He buys them gifts. He performs a degrading tap dance for their affection, pouring his energy into a black hole of their design. By doing this, he feeds their ego a massive feast, teaching them that their withdrawal is the easiest way to extract his compliance. He forgets the absolute law of the velvet dagger. Power does not negotiate with hunger. When you chase a manipulator who is deliberately pulling away, you show them exactly how deeply you are starving for their validation. To destroy this frame, you must become intimately comfortable with the cold. When they withdraw, you do not pursue. You do not interrogate them. You do not punish them with aggressive anger. You simply match their energy, or better yet, you completely ignore the shift and return your absolute focus to your own mission. If they offer silence, you give them the void. You let them sit in the freezing temperature of their own manufactured distance. You do this because you recognize that their game is fundamentally childish, and a sovereign adult does not negotiate with toddlers throwing quiet tantrums in the corner. When the manipulator realizes that their withdrawal did not cause you to panic, when they see that your life continues to advance with brutal efficiency regardless of their mood, their frame collapses. They experience a sharp, sudden wave of anxiety because they realize they have absolutely no leverage over your nervous system. They will quickly attempt to reset the dynamic, suddenly acting warm and affectionate again, trying to pull you back in. But the power has already shifted permanently. You have proven that you control the meaning of the interaction. You dictate the terms of your own emotional state. Controlling the frame requires a ruthless suspension of your own ego. You must stop caring about proving your innocence to people who are committed to misunderstanding you. You must stop trying to demonstrate your loyalty to people who are actively testing it. The moment you become desperate to prove your worth instantly plummets to zero. True reality distortion is not about convincing other people that you are powerful. It is about being so completely grounded in your own authority that their attempts to manipulate you bounce off like paper arrows hitting armor. They are inviting you to step onto their stage and play the fool. You simply decline the invitation. You look at them with a calm, clinical detachment, observing their frantic attempts to pull your strings, knowing that the strings were cut a long time ago. Controlling the frame protects you in the moment, but sustaining that authority requires an evolution that happens strictly in the dark. You cannot simply adopt the posture of a king and expect the world to bow if your kingdom is built entirely on sand. Presence without capability is just an empty costume. It may deceive naive people for a brief moment, but the second the environment applies real pressure, the fabric tears, and everyone sees the terrified actor underneath. Consider the corporate environment or any high-stakes social arena. There is always the man in the impeccably tailored, loud suit. He speaks rapidly in industry buzzwords, he networks aggressively, and he makes sure his signature is attached to every minor, insignificant victory. But beneath the polished, manicured exterior, there is a deep, frantic insecurity. He knows, and his enemies quietly know, that his position relies entirely on perception. If the perception fades, he is nothing. Now, observe the quiet professional in the same building. He does not advertise his achievements. He does not dress for applause. He rarely speaks in meetings. But if he were to suddenly clear out his desk and walk out the door, 3 major departments would immediately collapse into chaos. The loud man has a fragile image. The quiet man has lethal weight. Mainstream psychology attempts to sell you a dangerous delusion. It tells you that confidence is merely a mindset. It suggests that if you stand in front of a mirror and recite daily affirmations, repeating to yourself that you are a powerful, highly valued individual, reality will somehow alter itself to match your delusion. This is absolute poison. You cannot hack your way to genuine authority. Your nervous system is far too ancient and intelligent to be tricked by your own cheap lies. If you chant that you are a force to be reckoned with, but you repeatedly fail to keep the most basic promises you make to yourself, your brain will recognize the fraud. It will flood you with crippling anxiety the exact moment you are tested, because it knows you have no actual ammunition in your weapon. Real confidence is not a mood, it is an undeniable ledger of evidence. You build this ledger in the shadows, far away from the applause of an audience. You build it by surviving difficult, monotonous things. You build it by choosing the absolute discipline of the grind when every fiber of your being is screaming for comfort and distraction. When you commit to mastering a complex skill, when you meticulously manage your finances so you are never entirely dependent on a toxic boss or a manipulative partner, when you train your physical body until it becomes a resilient instrument of endurance, you are accumulating the only currency that truly matters. You are gathering leverage. Leverage is the heavy, brutal reality that you can survive without them, but they cannot operate at peak efficiency without you. When you possess actual, undeniable competence, you do not need to announce your boundaries with a megaphone. The boundary is implicitly enforced by the sheer gravity of what you bring to the table. People do not casually disrespect the architect of their success. They do not test the limits of the person holding the keys. Remember our absolute law: power does not negotiate with hunger. The man who relies entirely on his charm or his compliance is always hungry because he constantly needs new people to validate him in order to maintain his illusion of worth. He is a parasite feeding on external approval. But the highly competent man is entirely self-sustaining. He knows his exact market value, whether that market is professional, social, or romantic. He knows precisely the hours of isolation it took to build his skills, and he knows exactly how difficult it would be for anyone to replace him. This internal knowledge fundamentally alters his biology. It slows down his breathing. It deepens his voice. It removes the subtle, pathetic scent of desperation that predatory people rely on to identify their next target. When a highly competent man is threatened with isolation, or when someone tries to manipulate him by withdrawing their favor, he does not panic. He simply calculates his next move, knowing with cold certainty that his skills, his discipline, and his focus will be highly demanded in any room he chooses to enter next. But there is a critical, fatal trap you must avoid during this phase of construction. You must fiercely protect your development from premature exposure. The weak man learns a new skill for 3 days and immediately broadcasts it to the world, desperate to harvest temporary validation before the work is actually finished. He tells his toxic friends and his doubtful family members about his grand plans to escape his current environment. By doing this, he gives them the exact timeline they need to plant seeds of doubt and sabotage his efforts. The strategic operator understands that seeds do not grow faster when you constantly dig them up to show everyone how much they have sprouted. You must work entirely beneath the surface. You must let people continue to underestimate the depth of your preparation. Underestimation is an incredible, highly advantageous tactical position. While they dismiss you as ordinary, you study the board. While they gossip about trivial drama, you accumulate resources. While they waste their weekend performing for strangers on a screen, you construct a quiet, impenetrable fortress of capability. You let them believe you are exactly the same predictable person you were a year ago, right up until the exact moment your leverage becomes absolute and undeniable. Then, when the pressure mounts and everyone else is frantically searching for a savior, you calmly provide the solution. You do not boast about it, you do not ask for a parade. You simply demonstrate that you are the fixed point in a turning world. This transition from a compliant pawn to an undeniable asset completely short-circuits the people who used to look down on you. They can no longer afford to treat you as a disposable commodity. Your presence becomes heavy, your silence becomes loaded. When you finally align this invisible leverage with a refusal to be moved, you enter the final phase of the game. When you finally align this invisible leverage with a refusal to be moved, you enter the final phase of the game. You transition from building power in the shadows to wielding it as your absolute baseline reality. This is the phase of sovereign gravity. Imagine the exact same scenario that used to destroy your peace of mind a year ago. A manipulative partner tests a clear boundary. A toxic colleague attempts to throw you under the bus in front of an audience. In the past, this would have triggered an immediate, humiliating cascade of panic, over-explanation, and desperate attempts to restore the peace. You would have bled emotional energy for days, replaying the conversation in your head, wondering what you did wrong. But now, the internal architecture is entirely different. Now, they push against you, and they do not hit a soft, yielding cushion of compliance. They hit a wall of cold, unfeeling stone. You do not raise your voice. You do not draft a lengthy message explaining why their behavior is unacceptable. You simply observe their action, calculate the appropriate response, and execute it without a single trace of emotion. This absolute lack of emotion is the most terrifying response a manipulator can encounter. People who play dark social games expect your anger. They welcome your anger because anger is just another form of engagement. When you yell, when you argue, when you show them how deeply they have hurt you, you are still proving that they have absolute control over your internal state. You are showing them that they matter. Anger is the chaotic, frantic energy of the powerless. A sovereign operator does not get angry. He simply adjusts access. If someone disrespects your time, you do not scold them. You simply make yourself permanently unavailable for future favors. If someone lies to you, you do not demand a tearful apology. You quietly revoke their clearance to your trust, and you let them live with the severely downgraded version of the relationship. You deliver the consequence so swiftly and so silently that they are left completely disoriented. They realize, with a sudden, freezing chill, that your boundaries are no longer up for debate. There will inevitably come a moment when the people from your past return to test this new version of you. They will circle back, deploying the old tactics that used to guarantee your submission. They will offer a half-hearted apology, or they will act as if nothing ever happened, expecting you to eagerly welcome them back because you always feared losing them. A Machiavellian thinker understands that forgiveness without changed behavior is not compassion, it is just permission. You look at their return not with sentimentality, but with clinical accuracy. You let them encounter the silence. You let them realize that the version of you they could easily exploit has been permanently erased. This is what it means to become the center of your own life. For years, you have lived in the orbit of other people. You adjusted your daily trajectory to avoid colliding with their unpredictable moods. You dimmed your own light so you would not outshine their fragile egos. You checked your phone the second you woke up, letting a delayed text message completely destroy your focus for the day. You were a satellite, endlessly circling planets that did not even possess their own atmosphere. That era is over. When you establish sovereign gravity, you become the sun in your own solar system. Your mood does not depend on who replies, who approves, or who decides to stay. You no longer move to accommodate the room. You stand completely still, and you force the room to adjust to you. This is not about displaying arrogance. Arrogance is a loud, fragile, and theatrical performance by a man who is secretly terrified of being exposed as a fraud. Sovereign gravity is entirely quiet. It is the deep, internal knowing that you have survived your own weaknesses. You have built undeniable, highly valued competence in the dark, and you no longer require a single shred of external validation to prove that you possess weight. As you inhabit this new reality, something fascinating begins to happen to your immediate environment. You do not even need to aggressively cut toxic people out of your life. They will naturally begin to self-select out. Manipulators, opportunists, and emotional vampires are like parasites. They require a very specific, warm, highly compliant environment to survive. When you drop the temperature of your emotional responses to absolute zero, they freeze. They cannot feed on your iron boundaries. They cannot extract any dark energy from your profound silence. They will quickly realize that you are too heavy to move and too sharp to touch. Without a single word being spoken, they will quietly pack up their games and go search for an easier, softer target. Let them go. Endure the temporary quiet. Do not mourn the loss of people who only loved you when you were weak and easily managed. The empty space they leave behind is the exact space required for high-value allies, true partners, and genuine opportunities to finally enter your life. You must remember the ultimate law of human dynamics we have woven through this entire strategy. Power does not negotiate with hunger. You have spent enough of your life starving. You have starved for recognition. You have starved for respect. And you have starved for the basic dignity of being seen as an equal. You tried to buy these things by being the most accommodating, polite, and flexible person in the room. You paid for their comfort with your own identity. It did not work. It will never work. The world studies your behavior to discover exactly how it is permitted to treat you. Every time you apologize for something that is not your fault, you teach them to blame you. Every time you accept crumbs, you teach them that you do not require a seat at the table. You must ruthlessly audit your own behavior, starting today. Strip away every action, every nervous laugh, and every micro-expression that signals a plea for permission. Walk into rooms with the quiet, heavy certainty of a man who has already validated himself in the dark. Speak only when your words carry undeniable weight, and let your silence do the rest. Build the kind of leverage that makes your presence a highly guarded asset and your absence a legitimate threat. And when they test you, because human nature guarantees they will always test you, look them directly in the eyes and give them absolutely nothing but the void. You are no longer auditioning for the role of a secondary character in your own existence. You are the architect. You are the sovereign authority. You are the quiet, lethal force they never saw coming. The game is always being played. The only question is whether you are a player or a pawn. Let us speak practically before we part ways. From a purely psychological standpoint, the first time you enforce these laws, your brain will scream at you. Your nervous system is deeply addicted to the chaotic cycle of pleasing and panicking. The withdrawal symptoms of breaking that addiction will feel exactly like guilt. You must recognize that it is not guilt. It is simply the weakness leaving your system. I continuously observe the growth of this community, and I see a quiet, lethal alliance of individuals who refuse to remain prey. Your presence here, your comments, and your decision to subscribe do not merely support a video, they help construct a massive, invisible architecture of truth. I acknowledge your focus, and I respect your discipline. Stay cold, stay sharp, and return to this space whenever you need to be reminded of who you are actually meant to be.